Hello, I'm CL Backstrom, and I'm here today to introduce you to a presentation that Trillium Awakening teacher Sanji Hills made. Sanji titled her presentation, The Power of Three. As a preface to her presentation, she mentioned how prevalent the number three is, even in common everyday language. Like she gave the example, like how often might we say the expression three's the charm. She also pointed out that the number three is found as a significant number in many, if not most, spiritual and religious paths. She spoke a little bit, for example, of how the number three is very influential in Christianity. And more particularly, she spoke about Catholicism. And then Sanji began to open up to talk about the number three with regard to Trillium Awakening. I turn this over to her now so that you can hear her presentation. Thank you.
So Richard Rohr keeps bringing the Trinity into his writing, and he has a regular blog, and I actually shared this with CL this week. He'd come back to the Trinity again in this week's blog, because he feels that it's a mystery that modern Western Christianity has lost sight. They've lost sight of the mystery at the heart of the Trinity. We talk sort of blithely about the Trinity, but perhaps lost. And the early church fathers who developed the theology of the Trinity saw it as a wonderful mystery that could never be understood with the rational mind. That contemplation of God as Trinity was made to order to undercut our dualistic mind. And many of the Catholic mystics, he says, were Trinitarians. They wrote or spoke about the Trinity: Meister Eckhart, Julian of Norwich, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila. He argues that contemplation of the Trinity invites us to an interactive experience of God. So there's the transpersonal Father, the personal Christ, and the impersonal Holy Spirit all at once. And it's the dynamic between the three that he describes as the divine dance. The 12th century Scottish theologian Richard at St. Victor taught that for God to be truth, it had to be one; for God to be love, it had to be two; and for God to be joy, there had to be three. And I think that's lovely, the idea that the threeness is joyful. And as I put on the invitation to this sitting, that Richard Rohr argues that the principle of three is inherently moving, dynamic, and generative. It's creative. It represents creative tension, but also stability. So you can't imagine a stool, for instance, with less than three legs. So it gives that sort of stability, but also a tension between the different elements. So coming back to why it's important for me, or has been from the start of being involved with the Trillium work. Well, I was very involved in the human potential movement in my 20s and early 30s, and I did a lot of groups and encounter work, and for a few years, body work, bioenergetics, I trained as a massage therapist. So the down work, I did lots of down work early on. And then I got involved with Rajni Shosho, and one of the things I loved about his work was that he invited a lot of the group leaders from the human potential movement out to his ashram in India. And there we had an opportunity to do the down work, but in a spiritual environment. So we were meditating and doing down work together, and I loved that. And then a little later, I also got into psychosynthesis for a while, which also combines the spiritual and the psychological. But at root, I studied sociology originally, and I've always been fascinated by group behavior and the nature of human relationships, and I was quite interested in the idea of living in a community for a while. And although human potential work was about relationship, in a sense that was never satisfactorily linked. You know, what did it mean in terms of the spiritual side? And then later I moved on to various consciousness traditions, Advaita Vedanta and subtle energy as a form of meditation. And in that, both the down work and the relationship aspect was almost entirely missing. We just didn't talk about what the work meant to us. So you just didn't get that interchange with other people. So when I came across Waking Down in Mutuality, as it was then called, which brought the three elements together, in one spiritual path, there was a real sort of bang, bing with me. You know, it was just like, oh yes, this is what I've been looking for. And acknowledging the interrelationship and the tensions between the three dimensions. And I know quite a few people had difficulties when Waking Down in Mutuality was renamed as Trillium. But for me, again, I had a big yes to that, because it was, again, it was focusing absolutely on the threeness, a flower with three petals. And it seemed such an apt way to illustrate the threefold core structure. It's like that's the very core, the structure that everything else builds on. And also the mystery of that, like the Trinity, is simultaneously that it's all one, the onlyness, and it's three distinct dimensions at the same time. And again, it sort of undercuts the rational mind, because we want to put things in boxes. And I'm working on this here, I'm doing that there. But it doesn't. It's constantly bringing it into that sort of creative tension and dynamism. So that's a little bit about what it means to me. But I wondered what it might mean to you, threefold elements. And I wanted to invite you to reflect on this before we have a little discussion. And I'm going to lead you through 3 steps in doing that. Another 3. So can I just invite you to, you can close your eyes if you like, just go inside for a moment. Just drop down inside. And can you think of a time when you were working on one of those dimensions? It might have been consciousness or embodiment, downwork, or on relationships, or perhaps a particular relationship. There are many courses and workshops out there and paths that focus on one of the 3. Or you might just have been moved by something in your life that led you to focus on one element. It might be a breakup of a relationship, or struggling with something going on in your body that led you into some kind of therapeutic work. How did it go for you? And how easy was it to sustain this work over time? Just spend a bit of time with that one. Now, can you think of a way in which another of the 2 dimensions came into the picture and helped you through a sticky patch? So, for example, I mean, for me, if I'm going to do exercise, it's much easier if I do that with a friend. So I've got the relationship and the class. Or if I'm working on an emotional challenge, having a spiritual practice alongside that sort of supports it and nourishes it. So can you think of a time when you had 2 of those elements supporting one another? And when you think about this, you might even think about how does it land in your body when you've got 2 dimensions going? How does it feel to you? And now I just want you to move on to thinking of an area in your life, perhaps since becoming involved with Trillium or Waking Down, in which you were working on all 3 elements simultaneously. So you're working on consciousness or awareness, you're doing down work, perhaps exploring an emotional issue, and working with others, sharing one-to-one with someone, close, or a teacher, or perhaps sharing in a mutuality group or another group, or with a close friend, all at the same time. Just picturing that in a moment. So what's your sense of that? How does that feel to you in your body? Do you have a sense of what difference it made to have all three elements in the picture at the same time? Okay, thank you. Can I invite you to come back into the room, as it were? And would anyone like to share anything about what came up during that